Well, Matthew's gospel forms a bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament, the 39 books from Genesis to Malachi, were written over a period of over 1,000 years. More history is covered in those 39 books, but it was written in about or over a 1,000-year period, whereas the events of the New Testament happened in a single lifetime. It's a much shorter period of time than the Old Testament. And yet, the Old Testament is what anticipates, it looks forward to, and predicts the New Testament. The Old Testament is waiting for the fulfillment of all of the promises that it has made, especially concerning Jesus Christ. One way to think about the relationship of the Old Testament and the New Testament is that the new is in the old contained, the old is in the new explained. The New Testament is in the Old Testament. It's anticipated. It's spoken about. The new is in the old contained. The old is in the new explained. All that was promised is explained in the New Testament. And you're going to read, especially in Matthew, this was written that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of by the prophet. That phrase is mentioned 16 times in the Gospel of Matthew, as the Old Testament is being fulfilled in the New Testament. Now, between the Old Testament and the New Testament is a 400-year period. In fact, if you have your Bibles open and you're opened up to the chapter 1 of Matthew, you just turn left a page, maybe 2 pages, and you're in Malachi. Well, between Malachi and Matthew is a 400-year period of time. That's a big gap in time. It's often called the 400 silent years. Not because nothing happened during those 400 years. In fact, I'm going to take some significant time this morning to explain what happened during those 400 years. Because a lot of things changed between the closing of the Old Testament book of Malachi and the opening of the book of Matthew. So first, we're going to look at some history. The history of what took place. The 400 silent years are called that simply because God didn't speak anything during those 400 years, or there was no divine revelation. After Malachi, there was a pause. God pushed the pause button, anticipating the forerunner. That was one of the last predictions that someone would represent the Messiah, would come on the scene and point the way to the Messiah, that, of course, being John the Baptist. So here's what happened. The Medo-Persian Empire is in charge of the world at the close of the Old Testament in Malachi. It's the Medo-Persian Empire. But we open the New Testament and suddenly it's the Roman Empire that's in charge. Not only that, but the people are speaking a new language. Instead of Aramaic, most people in the world are speaking and reading Greek. So a lot has changed in that time. How did all that happen? How did all that change come about? If you remember in the book of Daniel chapter 2, Daniel was able to interpret a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had, where he saw this huge metallic image that had a head of gold. It had a chest and arms of silver, stomach and thighs of bronze, and then legs of iron, and then feet partly of iron, partly of clay. And Daniel comes in and he says, I know what that dream is about. What you saw, King Nebuchadnezzar, is a succession of world-governing empires, kingdoms, beginning with you as king of Babylon. You're that head of gold. But after you, an inferior kingdom, the Medo-Persian Empire, will come in and take over. And they did. And that's where the Old Testament leaves off. Now, the Medo-Persian Empire allows the Jewish people to return back from their captivity. So they were permissive for the Jews to go back to their land, but they were slow to do so because they had settled in. They had gotten comfortable where they were, and they were into building their own homes instead of building the temple, until a couple of prophets come along and say, hey, you need to focus first on God's house, God's temple in Jerusalem, and that's more or less where the Old Testament stops. But Daniel, in his prediction, he predicted 2 more kingdoms that would rule the earth. The third kingdom is the kingdom of Greece. As history pans out from the New Testament perspective, looking back, Greece ruled the world under Alexander the Great. After him was eventually Rome. Well, how did that happen? Well, while the Medo-Persian Empire enjoyed their newly found victory over the Babylonians, there was a man in the West who was able to unite two countries, Greece and Macedonia. His name was Philip of Macedon. He was very successful, but he was now the rival. He has the rival empire in the West against the Medo-Persians in the East. To make a long story short, Philip was assassinated, and most believe it was by the Medo-Persians. But Philip had a young son named Alex, or you know him as Alexander the Great. And when he was growing up, Alexander, he was more into reading books and staying indoors. He was not so much of an outdoors kind of guy. So Philip decided to get his son a tutor. So he hires this tutor by the name of Aristotle. Maybe you've heard of him. So Aristotle is his tutor, and he helps young Alexander to become great. And his dad, Philip, he was assassinated when Alexander was 19 years old. And this did something inside of young Alexander where he decides, I am going to take vengeance on my enemies. And Alexander the Great, he took the banner of spreading Greek culture and Greek victory around the world, beginning with the Medo-Persian Empire, and he conquered them. In fact, his victories were so swift that he even surprised himself. And within 10 years, Alexander the Great controlled the entire known world from Egypt to Syria, Asia Minor, Asia, all the way down to India. And at the age of 29, he ruled the world and he got bored. He had nothing else to do. There were no more kingdoms to conquer. And 2 years later, he dies in Babylon of a drunken stupor. He controlled the world, but he was miserable. He was so unhappy. And while he was dying, he was asked, "To whom shall your kingdom go?" And Alexander said, "Give it to the strong." He had 4 strong generals, and the kingdoms were divided. It was divided into 4 sections under those 4 generals. Cassander, he got Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus took Asia Minor and Thrace. Seleucus took Asia, including Syria, and Ptolemy took Egypt. And for years, there were rivalries within that split kingdom as to who would be in charge, and the main rivalry took place between the north, the kings of the north, that was the Seleucid kings, the Syrian kings, and kings of the south, the Ptolemaic kings, or the Egyptian kings. If you had a map and you were looking at all this, you would understand the dynamic, because sandwiched between the north of Syria and the south of Egypt is this little country called Israel. They're right in the middle of all of this. So Israel was always caught in the crossfire. And that's exactly what happened. And this went on for years and years and years. One notable king of Syria was named Antiochus IV. He gave himself this illustrious name of Antiochus, or Theos Antiochus, Theos Epiphanes, which is, I am God manifest in human flesh. So you could say he had a pride issue to give himself that name, but he had coins minted that said he was the victorious, illustrious one, God who came down to the earth. So he presents himself as a god, in essence. And he hated the Jewish people, so much so that they became his number one target. He marched on them several times. He stopped the sacrifices in the temple at one time. And it was so dramatic that the Jewish people called this the abomination of desolation. He commanded that a pig be killed on the altar of sacrifice in the outer court of the temple, and that the temple be desecrated, that all of its holy vessels be taken and seized, that circumcision would be stopped, and that everyone would worship Zeus. It was a horrible period of time. And this continued until 165 BC, when a group of Hasmonean priests said, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. We're not going to worship Zeus. And when one of the representatives of the Syrian Empire was in their village, which was south of Jerusalem, that representative was commanding the people to worship Zeus, there was pushback by Mattathias. He revolted and staged a Maccabean revolt that continued with his sons under the leadership of the most famous son, which was known as Judas Maccabeus. You have heard of the Maccabean revolt, right? If you don't know it by that name, you do know the name Hanukkah. In fact, that's going on right now during the week of Hanukkah. It's the Jewish holiday. That's how it developed. That's what it came from. Eventually, in 165 BC, they were able to push out the Syrians from Jerusalem completely and start temple worship once again, worshiping Yahweh, ridding the temple of the false worship to Zeus. And as legend says, there was only one cruse of oil that would light this golden menorah for one day, but miraculously it lasted 8 days, and that's when Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights, was born. So the Jewish people got back control of their city, Jerusalem. They had control of Judah once again, and this continues until 63 BC, so about 100 years, until the Roman Emperor Pompey took over everything, and now the Romans marched throughout the known world, including Israel, including Jerusalem. So once again, Israel, Judea, and Jerusalem, and the Jewish people are under foreign occupation. But this time, it's not the Medo-Persians, it's not the Greeks, but Rome. Rome, just like Daniel predicted. And the Greek language, as proposed by Alexander the Great and his 4 generals, it had become the language of the entire world because it was so exact. It was so complete with its tenses and its cases and the ability to communicate in such an exact way, it became the language of the world. One more thing. The temple that had been rebuilt under Ezra and then with Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, it received a major renovation by Herod the Great when he was in charge of Judea. He took what Solomon did and he just went nuts. He renovated it. He made it even more grandiose. So now you have this enormous temple in Jerusalem. Now, another interesting thing, in the Old Testament, you never read about a synagogue. You don't find it in the Old Testament. But suddenly you come to the New Testament and, well, there's this synagogue here, and then there's multiple synagogues in the city of Jerusalem along with the temple. It is believed that the synagogue came from the necessity of the Jewish people when they were in foreign captivity. Since they had no temple, they devised a way to go through the law of the Old Testament and to meet together. So in Babylon, they developed a synagogue. And in Hebrew, the word synagogue means gathering together, the gathering together. And they would gather together, they would read the scriptures and make comments on the scriptures. The rabbis would say, this is what Moses meant, and this is how we apply it to our lives. So as we open the pages of the New Testament, now we know why Rome is in charge, why the temple and a synagogue both exist, they're both present and active, and why people are speaking Greek as well as Aramaic. So that's a lot of backdrop, it's a lot of story, but it helps you understand what we're landing in here in the Gospel of Matthew. And all of this brings us up to speed historically for the New Testament. Now, the first 4 books are known as the Gospels. The first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels. They follow a synopsis or the same approach. John departs from that and he writes his completely different. But all 4 of them have a particular emphasis. Matthew emphasizes Jesus as the sovereign, the king, the one predicted in the Old Testament. Mark portrays Jesus as the servant, the one doing, going out and accomplishing the will of God. Luke portrays Jesus as the Son of Man, relating to mankind, that he's one of us. He's compassionate towards us. He's showing human emotions. John emphasizes his deity as the Son of God. And all 4 Gospels have a particular audience in mind. Matthew was written by a Jew for the Jews. He's showing the Jewish people that this man, Jesus, fulfilled the Old Testament prophecy. It was written to the Jews. And the Gospel of Mark was written more with the Romans in mind to show that Jesus was the perfect servant, doing the will of his master, something that a Roman would respect. And Luke was written for the Greeks. The Greeks emphasized the perfect man. Jesus is seen as the perfect man, the Son of Man, he's often called in Luke's Gospel. John was written for the whole world, that For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, right? John 3:16. And the idea is that we might believe in him. These things were written that we might believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So that helps us to understand the Gospels. Now, in terms of Matthew, the title says the Gospel of Matthew. Maybe yours says the Gospel according to Matthew. Who is Matthew? He's a tax collector. He worked for the IRS, which means everyone hated him. And if you can believe it, in those days, people hated tax collectors even more than they do today because they were much less fair then than they are today. There was something in those days called tax farming, and senators or wealthy citizens purchased the ability to collect taxes from a certain area for 5 years from the central government of Rome. So a senator or a wealthy citizen would buy the right to farm the taxes and would collect the taxes from the people, and whatever amount beyond what was required by Rome, well, they got to pocket that money. So that's why they were hated so much. People knew that the tax collectors were making a profit off of the backs of the normal working person. So tax collectors were ostracized. In fact, you often read in the New Testament, in Matthew particularly, tax collectors and sinners. You see this phrase, tax collectors and sinners. They're always phrased together in the same sentence because really they were the same in most people's minds. No one saw a difference between the two. One was just as bad as the other. So they were kept out of the temple. They were kept out of the synagogue. And so it's no wonder that when we get to Matthew chapter 9, when Jesus walks up to Matthew, the tax collector, and says, "Matthew, follow me," he drops everything. He drops everything to follow Jesus. Why? Because no one had spoken a nice word to him in like 10 years or so. And let alone a religious person or even a rabbi who comes and says, "I'm choosing you to follow me." So Matthew's like, "I'm dropping everything. I'm dropping everything. I'm with him. I'm following him." Because Jesus gave his attention to someone who no one had any regard for at all. By the way, we know Matthew is Jewish because his original name was Levi, probably from the tribe of Levi. But as a former tax collector, he was qualified to write an account of Jesus' life and teachings because a tax collector of that day, they had to know Greek, they had to be literate, and be well organized. And some believe that Matthew was the recorder among the disciples and took notes of Jesus' teaching, which makes sense because his gospel has the most sayings and the things that Jesus said of all of the gospels, that he was like the secretary taking notes along the way. So as we begin this study of the Gospel of Matthew, we will consider Jesus' ancestry, birth, public ministry, his death, and his resurrection. And we will gain a clearer understanding of Jesus as both Messiah and King. So our series is called Christ the King. And I know that was a long introduction, but I wanted to give you the backdrop as we land here in Matthew chapter 1, where we now look at the genealogy of Jesus, the origins of his earthly right to sit on the throne as king. Now, I know some of you are wondering, really, a genealogy? We're going to just read a genealogy? Well, there is growing interest in the subject over the last 5-10 years. There's different websites you can go to find your genealogy and so forth, but this is important, and we're going to take some time to look at it. So looking at now the ancestry, we looked at the history, now the ancestry. Just reading verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, in the Greek, the book begins with just 2 words, Biblos, Genesis, the book of Genesis. It's the origin, or as it says here, genealogy. But it's the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ. Now, why are genealogies so important, and why do we begin the greatest story ever told with a genealogy? It sounds so boring, right? Not to a Jewish person. It was paramount. If you had land and you're in one of the tribes of Israel, you would want to know your genealogy, and pass the genealogy information on. Because if you ever had to sell that land and for that land to be purchased back again by a kinsman redeemer, you had to prove your genealogy to get that land back so that the land could stay within its tribal allotment. So genealogy is very important to a Jewish person. Also, if you were a priest, you had to prove your genealogy all the way back to Aaron unbroken. You had to show every single generation all the way back to Aaron unbroken, or you could not serve as a priest. And if a priest were to marry a woman, a Levite woman, she had to prove her genealogy for at least 5 generations. So it was important for land transactions, it was important for the priesthood, but it is all important for the Messiah. If you're going to say that this man is the Messiah, well, the question would be, well, can you prove it? Where was he born? What tribe does he come from? There are predictions made in the Bible of what tribe he would come from and where he would be born. So, yeah, if you're telling me that this one is the Messiah as fulfilled by all of the prophets of the Old Testament, I want to see some genealogical records. So this is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, first, the son of David, that is a messianic term. It's a title. This isn't the human genealogy just yet. It means more than just being a descendant of David. He will get to that in later verses, but it's a special term to refer to the anticipated Messiah that was to come. That's why when you read about Jesus healing people, the question was always raised, well, could this be the son of David? Meaning the Messiah. That's what they meant by that phrase. They knew he was a descendant of David, but in using this term, the son of David, they unmistakably meant the one predicted who would rule and reign and bring in the kingdom. That son of David. And in Revelation 22, verse 16, the Bible closes with Jesus saying, I am the root and the offspring of David. So when you read the son of David, it is a messianic term. And so is the next one. He says, the son of Abraham. That's another title. Jesus is the seed of Abraham, in whom all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So understand, this genealogy establishes Jesus' claim to the throne of David through his adoptive father, Joseph. This is not the blood lineage of Jesus through Mary. It is the legal lineage of Jesus through Joseph. The Gospel of Luke provides Jesus' blood lineage through Mary. So we're going to read 3 sections of 14 generations. 42 generations are listed from Adam to Christ. And they're broken up mnemonically. There's 3 sections of 14, so there is literary as well as genealogical symmetry. The literary structure by Matthew is not intended to set forth a strict biological lineage. The purpose of a genealogy is to document the proof of ancestry from the origin of the line to the person under discussion. It wasn't necessary to include every single individual, but only those necessary to establish descending relationships. So Matthew edited this list to make it easy for people to remember and memorize. And you're saying, wait, memorize? I can barely memorize anything. You're talking about memorizing a genealogy? Yes, people would memorize their genealogical records. Everything was written at that time, everything was written down. You had to use a scroll or some parchment, and that was expensive. So people memorized things, and even genealogical records, and especially something as important as the genealogy of the Messiah would have been memorized. So here we go. Are we ready? Like, yeah, Pastor, you stalled long enough of reading all those names, but here we go. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez begot Hezron, Hezron begot Ram, Ram begot Aminadab, Aminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. We'll discuss that. Solomon begot Rehoboam. Rehoboam begot Abijah. Abijah begot Asa. Asa begot Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat begot Joram. And Joram begot Uzziah. Uzziah begot Jotham. Jotham begot Ahaz. And Ahaz begot Hezekiah. Hezekiah begot Manasseh. Manasseh begot Amon. And Amon begot Josiah. Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers about the time they were carried away to Babylon. Verse 12, and after they were brought to Babylon, Jeconiah begot Shealtiel, and Shealtiel begot Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel begot Abiud. Abiud begot Eliakim, and Eliakim begot Azor. Azor begot Zadok. Zadok begot Achim, and Achim begot Eliud. Eliud begot Eleazar. Eleazar begot Matthan, and Matthan begot Jacob. And Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who was called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until the captivity in Babylon are 14 generations. And from the captivity in Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations. So it has symmetry based on the three major stages of Jewish history. Stage one is from the patriarchy of Abraham to the monarchy of David. Stage two is from the monarchy of David to the captivity in Israel, the captivity of Israel in Babylon. Stage three is from the captivity of Israel to the nativity of the Messiah. So all three major stages are covered. Now, there are some great names in this genealogy. There's also some surprises here. And maybe you have had or you have a relative somewhere in your family tree. Maybe you don't talk about a whole lot, you don't mention, but Jesus had a number of them as well in his family tree. Now, as I read through this, or I've read through this, there's just something that it may be obvious, but I think it bears repeating. The Bible always makes an appeal to history. The Bible isn't just a spiritual book apart from the historical record and documentation in which it resides in its context. It has a historical context. The Bible is history. The Bible appeals to the facts of history. In fact, when it comes to Jesus Christ, we are dealing with someone who divided time between BC and AD. I mean, every time we pay tribute, every time we write in a legal document or something where we write the date at the top of something or at the bottom of something, it bears testimony that Jesus divided time. It points to the birth of Jesus. As soon as you write the date, it attests to the fact that in our calendar, we are recording the fact that Jesus split time. It appeals to history. It also appeals to prophecy. Matthew will demonstrate that Jesus was predicted over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament and will appeal to prophecy. This was written that it might be fulfilled by the prophet. When I was born, nobody was predicting my birth. Maybe my parents were like, what day is it going to be? But no one was making these long-term predictions. It was just another birth. But what makes Jesus so unique is the number of predictions that he fulfilled from the Old Testament, about 330. And some of those predictions were made by or made to some of the people listed in this genealogical record. To Abraham, for example, God said in Genesis 12, verse 3, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." That's a prophecy that the world would ultimately be blessed by bringing forth the most important Jewish person ever, the Messiah, Jesus. That's how the world gets blessed. One day, he will rule and reign over all. So that's something he made to Abraham. To David, who's also mentioned in this genealogical record, God says in 2 Samuel 7:16 that your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. Another reference to the Messiah. And then, of course, Isaiah 9:6-7. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Verse 7, of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. Now, these are just 3 of the 330 predictions that are made. So the Bible appeals not only to history, but also to prophecy. And Matthew does several times in this book. Now, I want to go back and notice some of the names. We're not going to dissect every name listed here, but we're going to look at some of them. Abraham. Abraham is a man of faith, right? We know him to be a man of faith. He was also a man of unbelief, wasn't he? He lied about his wife being his sister, not once, but twice, because he didn't trust God. David is mentioned in verse 1, and again later, verse 6. He was the greatest king of Israel. He was a man after God's own heart. He was also an adulterer, a murderer, and a cover-up artist. In verse 2, Jacob is mentioned. And if you recall, Jacob was a con man. He was a deceiver. After him is Judah. Judah was a womanizer. And as you start going through this list, I hope you start seeing some personal connection and personal application. Do you ever feel like, I'm just not worthy to be in God's family? I've messed up so much. I recognize my own sin. I'm such a failure. I try, and then I fall, and then I fail. I'm just not worthy. Well, let me just say that look at the company you're in. Look at the company I'm in. God includes these people in his genealogical record of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And if you look at verse 3, you see something very strange. For a genealogical record, the names of women. Notice Tamar in verse 3, Rahab and Ruth are in verse 5, and her who had been the wife of Uriah, verse 6. Women were rarely mentioned in ancient genealogies. And that's simply because in their ancient customs, not a biblical concept, but women were regarded as the property of her father and eventually the property of her husband. But right off the bat, in the Gospel of Matthew, we start to see the door of liberation being opened. And who's doing the liberating of women? It was Jesus in his own genealogy. The women are included in his genealogical record. Now, the 4 mentioned here are worthy of special note as examples of God's grace. They show how God can take unlikely people and use them in great ways. So just looking at them, Tamar, if you know her story, she dressed up like a prostitute and lured her father-in-law, Judah, into a sexual relationship which brought forth twins, Perez and Zerah. Well, she's mentioned in his genealogical record. Rahab, verse 5, she was a Gentile prostitute for whom God took extraordinary measures to save from both judgment and her lifestyle of prostitution. She was converted to Yahweh. She believed in God after those 2 spies came and they were saved at the Battle of Jericho. And Ruth, there in verse 5. Now, Ruth is a great woman, but not genealogically speaking, because she was a Moabite from Moab. Moab was a country that came from the incestuous relationship between Lot and his 2 daughters. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, it says, no Moabite shall enter the congregation of the Lord up until the 10th generation. But Ruth was the one who was also converted. She came to trust in Yahweh. And after all the men in that family died, she says to her mother-in-law in Ruth 1, verse 16, she says, wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people should be my people, and your God, my God. She trusted in the God of Israel. And she becomes the great-grandmother of King David, a Moabite. And then you have her who had been the wife of Uriah. It's like he couldn't even say her name, but we know this is Bathsheba, who was in an adulterous relationship, infamous for her sin with David. When David looked and looked again, and he fixed his eyes upon her and lusted after her and committed adultery with her, and then got her husband killed, and you know how that story goes. Well, the first son of that relationship died. That child died. Their second son was Solomon, who was the next king after David. He is included, the third king of Israel, Solomon. These four women have an important place in the genealogy of Jesus to demonstrate that Jesus was not royalty according to human perception. He didn't come from some pure aristocratic background. These four women also have an important place in the genealogy of Jesus to demonstrate that Jesus identifies with sinners in his genealogy, even as he will in his birth, his life, his death, and resurrection. F.B. Meyer said, "Men and women, notorious for their evil character, lie in the direct line of his descent. This was permitted that he might fully represent our fallen race." He identifies with us in every way, even in his genealogy. Now, I want you to look again there at verse 16, where it says, "Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ." Matthew wanted to make it clear that Joseph was not the father of Jesus. He was the husband of Mary. Very, very clear in that phrasing, that wording there. Again, Matthew's genealogy is intended to show Jesus' legal ancestry, not that he was of Joseph's physical descent. So if you're a historian and you're going through this genealogical record, you could easily think, well, man, if someone were trying to sabotage the ancestry of the Messiah and tried to find a way, to make it into the Hall of Shame instead of the Hall of Fame, well, here it is. This would show that. But even in something that may seem like a boring list of names, this record shows how God throughout history has reached out to different people to make them his friends. He is the friend of sinners. He's still doing that today. He is the friend of sinners, and he's inviting you, he's inviting me to become a part of his family. So as we close in prayer, I want to pray for us, and if that's something you've never done, if you've never received his invitation to be a part of his family, I want to give you that opportunity this morning. Let's bow our heads together.